Welcome to Voices in the Wilderness, conversations about church and leader health. Thank you for listening. We encourage you to keep the conversation going. Voices in the Wilderness is brought to you by Preparing for Amazement Ministries, where we empower and equip churches and leaders to create lasting and transformational health. Visit amazed15.org to learn more. We also welcome any comments or suggestions. Simply email us at podcast@amazed15.org. My name is Marcus Carlson, and I'm here with our podcast guru, Peter Belschwinder. Today, our guest is Dr. David Wang, Cliff and Joyce Penner Chair for the Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders, and Associate Professor of Spiritual Formation and Clinical Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary.
Dave, welcome back. We're going to start our second episode with you talking about trauma, and I'm going to kick us off with a good question. So, what do you think is most important to the health of pastors, church staff, and ministry leaders?
Great question. The first place that I will start with is it's important for pastors to know that they are human as well, and that they also are followers of Christ as well. And we need to take seriously our own discipleship and our own formation. And, I encounter, and I struggle with this myself as well, but I've also seen this too often among pastors where it feels like everyone else's needs are important. Everyone else's discipleship is important, but my needs aren't, and when I think of long-term sustainable and faithful leadership, that has to involve us stewarding our own discipleship and, stewarding our physical health, stewarding our spiritual health and well-being, our relational health, our emotional health. And sometimes it might feel like it's selfish because it's, oriented towards ourselves. And what I like to say to that is that, if you don't have anything to give, you don't have anything to give. And I'm connecting to you, like our ministry is through the ministry of presence. And I have to connect with you as myself, not as a false self, So the best thing I can do is I can connect with you. I can minister with you as a whole self, rather than as, a false self or, only half of myself because I'm burnt out, or something like that. So we have to take seriously our own discipleship. We have to take seriously that our discipleship and formation is holistic, not just intellectual, but relational, spiritual, and emotional. And part of what being human, part of affirming our humanity is that we also have to accept and at times grieve our limitations. There are so many conversations that I have with pastors that are unwilling to accept that they can't help everyone, that they are not omnipresent, that they are not omnicompetent, that they're not good at everything. And that's okay. We can give ourselves permission to not be God. And for all of us is to accept and grieve our limitations.
Boy, I love that phrase. I think I'm going to use, steal, whatever, pillage, whatever makes sense, the grieving our limitations. Because I think as somebody who's really driven and like you, does like, a buffet of things, I don't like limitations, and I'm an Enneagram 8, so I like limitations even less, and let alone like, admitting them is a whole different thing. And I think a lot of pastors are helpers, regardless of their trauma or Enneagram number. And so to not only to choose to say no, but when you have to say no, or when you can't do something well or for somebody, I think one of the things that I struggled with in ministry was you say no to a church member, especially when it involves time or care. It's like you feel like you're saying no to the baby Jesus, right? That there's this kind of I'm German. I've got enough German in me that guilt isn't, in the DNA. But I think, in ministry, certainly that's a huge deal. And so I love that phrase, grieving our limitations. I think maybe I'll get that tattooed in Hebrew or something because that's something I need to own better. And I never saw it that way. I saw it more as of a frustration or a disappointment. But boy, grief is a much better word.
A lot of times we look at our own limitations and our own humanity with contempt. Like we are angry that we are not God. And again, maybe going back from that to a theme from our previous episode, that we're all wounded healers. I think there's something beautiful about serving other people, even in our limitations. And maybe it's our limitations that gives us the authority to accompany others. When I think of Christ and the way he went about redeeming humankind, out of all the different ways that God could have redeemed humankind, it just seems to me that God chose painful way possible. He could have stayed up in heaven and done something different than what happened, which was, have Jesus born, as human in the flesh, to suffer all the limitations and tragedies and challenges of being here on earth, and to die quite possibly the most painful way possible. And it says in Hebrews that we don't have a high priest who can't relate to what struggle here on earth, and maybe there was something intentional about this, where God chose this way to redeem humankind, because he wanted to save us as a wounded healer himself. And we're not supposed to be that celebrity pastor that can dominate a room at all times and find a perfect solution and fix everyone's problems. That if anyone could do that, that would have been God, and he didn't choose that approach. And maybe there's something we can learn about that in our leadership as well.
For sure. And painful and messy. I mean, a messy way to do this. And even messier now with free will and all of that. And, it's interesting because I think I struggle to, even though I preach it and I know it and I tell other pastors about it, I struggle to kind of, recognize, hey, like I'm not going to be able to do all of this, even though I know I'm not the Christ. I'm not, going to be able to command the room or always have it together or never lose my cool or, always have the answer. And I think, gosh, I mean, to think about that in terms of Jesus, and the celebrity pastor phenomenon, that's interesting in a different, podcast episode. I'm mostly jealous of those folks because I can't wear skinny jeans like that. So, but kind of shifting gears, because we talked about this kind of, again, this tie with the wounded healer. One of the things that I'm spending more time talking about and have not even an ounce of expertise compared to someone like you is vicarious trauma. And I think, that's a real thing in ministry, and maybe even more so post-pandemic. So talk to us a little bit about vicarious trauma, maybe help those that don't know that phrase a little bit. But how do you see vicarious trauma impacting pastors, church staff, ministry leaders today? Because I think that's a huge issue, not only for those leaders, but for the people they're leading, who are also supposed to be caring for their leaders. So could you share a little bit about the impact today of that issue of vicarious trauma?
Absolutely. I do a lot of trainings on trauma and spiritual formation with pastors and Christian leaders. And usually what brings people into the room is that, people have big hearts. They know that there's trauma in their congregations and their communities, and they want to come to get equipped and to meet their needs and to walk alongside our friends with trauma histories. And when I start opening my mouth and talking about trauma, I can see it in their eyes, that they start realizing, oh boy, this is actually me, and there's good reason. It's not just that research studies that we cited in our last episode about pastors having higher prevalence rates of trauma histories themselves, but it's also because of the nature of their vocation and their work. A trauma is actually defined by not only experiencing firsthand, a life-threatening event, but witnessing or being confronted with such an event. So it's possible for us to be exposed to trauma either directly, that is that, we're in the event itself. But it's also important to note that a trauma exposure can also be indirect. That is, if we bear witness or we walk alongside others who have survived a trauma. And when I think of a profession or a vocation that involves indirect exposure to trauma, I can't think of one that outside of maybe if you're in the military or ER doctors or something like that. Yeah, being a pastor means that you're going to be exposed to trauma at very, very, very high rates, and especially if you're a pastor that's a good pastor, meaning that people trust you when they're in
Mm.
crisis, they will go to you. It's 2 a.m. and they only have a few people to call, and you're one of them because you're the kind of pastor that's been there for them. That means you're doing your job, and at the same time, that means you're going to get those 2 a.m. calls, and those 2 a.m. calls means that you're going to get indirectly exposed to trauma. So we need to take vicarious trauma seriously because that's part of the hazards of our work.
It's great. It reminded me of a story of a pastor we interviewed, and it really hit me because it was right before, like I'm a seminarian right now. It was before I even thought of going into seminary, but it was during COVID. Loved ones were told in New York City they had 5 minutes left with their loved one, and this pastor was given 3 minutes by the spouse because they
Mm.
wanted their spouse to have 3 minutes with their pastor and then 2 minutes for themselves. And it was like, wow. You don't realize how serious some of these situations are until you kind of hear about it and then you're facing it. So, for me, I'm taking in so much and I'm like, oh boy, I'm a far way off when it comes to trauma and dealing with trauma and ministering to people who have experienced it, but also just guarding yourself from trauma. So
Indeed.
I think it's important as a young guy to start learning about this, start reading about it. So I'm thinking from a congregational perspective, what would you wish that members in the congregation knew about pastors and ministry staff that would help them be healthier churches and healthier leaders?
Yeah. I think a good starting point is that, as I mentioned earlier, pastors and Christian leaders, they're human too. They carry their own, oftentimes deep emotional wounds. And I've heard so many stories of, these kinds of wounds being inflicted by other Christian leaders, by even congregation members. And, sometimes it's common for congregation members who've been hurt by, authority figures in the past to, project some of that angst onto the pastor, even though the pastor is a totally different person and, totally different situation. And it's possible for congregation members to be triggered, by pastors because of that. And it goes the other way around too, that I've worked with a lot of pastors who are triggered by congregation members that just go after them, and because they also have been hurt by similar experiences like that as well, and we talked about the celebrity pastor kind of mentality, and continuing that. I mean, I think it's just harmful for everyone. It's not good for churches. It's not good for congregations, and it's also not good for the pastor either. They feel like they have to be the rock star all the time. They feel like they have to live up to this ideal that is just not human. That's actually not very similar to Jesus himself, and it's not healthy for them either. So, can we as congregations create a system where everyone in the congregation has permission to be human and to grow
Mm.
and to continue in their discipleship? And while pastors also have permission to be human and also learn and grow and continue in their discipleship as well, can we all grow together and walk alongside each other?
Yeah, that's I mean, that's huge. And I can think of so many times. I mean, we work a lot with churches that are in transition or crisis, or where there's been trauma at the hands of the pastor. And so I'm, in some ways used to those situations, but you never will or should get used to those situations, I would say. And so even to this day, like things that I've processed that happened to me, 20 years ago in ministry, something will happen, and it can be very, very triggering. I had an interesting experience last month. I was leading a board meeting with the church I'm working with, and we had another pastor sit in, a new first time pastor, lead pastor, who said, "Hey, I want to see how I've worked in unhealthy churches. I want to see, what a healthy meeting looks like." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And lo and behold, like I get triggered in the meeting,
Oh.
and 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 I let it. I mean, I got real worked up and got my voice nice and elevated and nice and German. And I'm like, of all the times to, observe a healthy meeting. And it was fine. A lot of it was miscommunication, and we worked it out in the room. And it was a gift because this church had very authoritarian pastors historically, and never a pastor who would like say mea culpa, right? And so it was really interesting afterwards. I'm meeting with this pastor, and I said, "Hey, sorry about some of that," right?
Mm.
I wasn't in my best form, but I think it's all okay. And he said, "Well, yeah, it's okay." And he said, he knew some of the history, and he said that's the first time they've probably ever seen a pastor show humility and say, "Hey,
Oh.
I'm not at my best right now," and that was not the best response. And again, I was grieving my limitation, to use the phrase, right?
Yeah.
I was grieving my limitation in the moment, like, kind of feeling as I'd let this young pastor down, because it wasn't terrible, terrible, but it was not, my finest moment either. And I think that again, it's tricky because some places that's a deal breaker. You feel like you can't make those mistakes. Other places, it almost becomes a gift when you make those mistakes
Yeah.
because the church has not seen that, or they don't see the pastor as human too. And I think that's a huge issue. People don't realize I make a lot of jokes about bourbon in my sermons, not just because I really love bourbon, but because there's this kind of human element. And so what do you think these cultures can do where people, I agree with you, like people need to be more free to, Jay Baker used to say, come in with a limp, right? Dragging the keg from last night's, party behind you. How do we create, in your opinion, as somebody who's, again, a pastor, a theologian, and a psychologist, how do we create those cultures where everyone can feel safe to limp,
Yeah.
including the pastor?
Yeah. When I think of healthy couples, I work with a lot of couples in my private practice. And I think of what are embodied indicators that a marriage is strong. Them never arguing is actually not an indicator that you have a strong marriage. In fact,
Pray people.
oftentimes, yeah, oftentimes if you never argue, that's actually a sign of an unhealthy marriage,
Yeah.
because I've met so many couples that don't argue because they simply don't communicate. They're not very close, and they're just, they function as roommates, or they avoid topics. And intimacy is actually built by negotiating, by working through conflict, by being honest with each other. And if you do conflict well, you're actually going to be closer at the end than at the beginning. So a conflict isn't necessarily a threat. It's actually an opportunity as well. Of
Mm.
course, granted, many of us have seen many examples of conflicts just being destructive, so it's understandable that many of us view it as a threat. But if we can model and learn, and it's a skill, just like preaching or, riding a bike, uh, communicating and having conflict, doing conflict well is a skill that that I feel if we can learn how to do that well, we can do a lot of good, and we can actually build some really solid, strong relationships and friendships and community.
I want the people who are listening who know me well or have been around me to know that I did not pay David to talk about conflict and did not even suggest it. We are talking about conflict all the time in our ministry. I'm constantly talking about conflict. And the word opportunity is one of my favorites. So, I just have to say I didn't arrange that, but thank you. Because again, the more that we hear that said, the better, because I do think that's true. And again, following Jesus is really hard, and we're supposed to do that together. And I mean, that's kind of part of the point of the church, right? And so, yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I think that there is greater intimacy and greater opportunity in conflict. But again, it's counterintuitive, to what we know in our culture. So, Dave, I appreciate you taking all this time. We had some technical glitches and ran over, so I appreciate your patience, your time. I really appreciate the work you're doing. This is helpful to our work and to pastors out there, and fun to continue to learn myself. Fun for Peter as a seminarian to soak this in, and really for our listeners. A lot of whom are pastors or ministry leaders, a lot of whom are, congregation members. That this is a very real thing, and we've got a pastoral crisis and a pastoral shortage, and this is not only a part of that crisis, but a huge part of the solution. So we really thank you for your time to do these 2 episodes with us, and patience with the technology and internet issues that come sometimes with weather and life.
Indeed, not a problem. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm thrilled that this podcast exists and grateful to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thanks again.